Well, welcome everybody to the first of the virtual philosophy alumni pathways panel. And what this is an attempt for current students to connect with former students who have walked in their shoes and done what they are now doing, and have some wisdom to share, advice to give, and maybe some warnings to offer. So the thought is that this is a way for the philosophy department to model what it looks like to think about existential pathways. And the pathways program at Furman obviously is a sort of holistic conception of advising and mentoring that is trying to say, look, we go to college for a bunch of reasons, not just to get jobs, but to find ways forward in order that the risks we take with our commitments and our joys and our time is also something directed towards stuff that we hope is true for us. And so the question that I ask all my students these days is, what will you do with your finitude? And tonight we get to hear from four fairly recent alums spanning 2015 to 2017, 18, I think. And so it's great to hear from them about what they've done with their finitude over the past few years and how they've navigated the pandemic and moved into careers, into families, into all kinds of interesting stuff. So we're glad to have you with us. If any of you who are watching this later have questions and would like to connect with any of these alums, please reach out to me and I will absolutely give you their email, and you can pester them at please all the wrong times when they're trying to get work done. And then just make sure you asterisk and say Simmons says payback is hell. So it's great to have you all with me and great to have them with us. So let's start off just by going around, having them introduce themselves, tell a bit about what they've been up to and their path and their direction, how it's played out. And then we'll open up a conversation and see where we go. So let's start with AJ, who is the old man among the group. AJ, tell us about yourself and what you've been up to.
Being the old man, gosh. So, hey, y'all, my name is AJ Calhoun. I graduated, as Dr. Simmons said, back in 2015. Which seems like quite a long time ago, but I guess wasn't. But tell you a little bit about what I have been up to since then. So after I left Furman, I moved to Southeast Asia and did a Fulbright in Malaysia for 2 years, which was an awesome experience, awesome way to take a lot of what I learned at Furman and bring it into the real world and learn a lot about, how sometimes what we're learning in the classroom applies and maybe some of it, how it doesn't, and out in the field. And I think one of the things I really took away from that experience was a desire to continue doing similar kind of impact focused work, but wanted to be back stateside and wanted to be nearer to issues around where I grew up, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so came back to the States, got my master's at University of Chicago, focusing on economic mobility. And now I work for an organization called Leading on Opportunity, which is housed at Foundation for the Carolinas, which is a community foundation here in Charlotte, North Carolina, my hometown, where we are advancing economic mobility for all of our citizens. So I lead our data and evaluation efforts. But as I have joked to my colleague who told me that I shouldn't say this to our stakeholders, but I will say to y'all that I think a lot of doing data work is an exercise in what I call applied epistemology. It's about creating meanings for people and figuring out how we know what we know and how do we get there. And so I'm going to be a big fan of the philosophy that I learned at Furman. And also, I guess an important thing also to say is that I'm in seminary as well right now, studying the intersection between theology and economics. And in that, investing a lot into kind of the kind of philosophical basis that I gained at Furman and kind of diving deeper into that space as well. So it's all kind of coming full circle, the economics piece, policy piece, the philosophy. And so that's what I've been up to, and excited for this conversation today.
That is fantastic. Thank you, AJ. And I told the people before we got going tonight that AJ actually was in my first intro to philosophy class I ever taught at Furman, and was one of 3 students that went with me to the first philosophy conference to which I took Furman students. So AJ and I have been thinking together for a lot of years. He's also one of the founders and sort of brain childs of the FCC group, the Furman Creative Collaborative, that then gave rise to the TEDx events. And so he's got a long history of his impact at Furman that continues to this day, doing really, really cool stuff. And so AJ, it's great to hear your story and have you with us. Let's jump up to Jocelyn. and a current Furman staff member. So tell us about your journey, Jocelyn.
Hey y'all. So you'll see I have a different background than I just had a few minutes ago. My spouse is making dinner and I don't want to y'all hear like all of that commotion. So I am currently sitting in my bed. It's very comfortable. I graduated with Maya in 2017. I'm originally from South Carolina. Even to this day, folks don't believe that I was just a single major in philosophy because my academic work and my professional work really lives at the intersection of philosophy, political science, justice work, and religion. After Furman, I went to Vanderbilt Divinity School and have a Master of Theological Studies. My thesis has a long title, which is called Communicative Pedagogy, an epistemic application of the homiletic theory of communicative ethics. All of that means is I took this passage in the New Testament where Jesus is existing in the home of these two sisters and applied that to how we do justice education in collegiate spaces and created my own pedagogy through this preaching theory called homiletic ethics. And after Vanderbilt, I was lucky enough to be able to move back home and just rested for 6 months. I think that's something that the pandemic has forced us into, is this intentional pause. But I was very grateful to have that season of pause where folks typically would say like, well, you didn't do anything during that season. And my response is, yes, I did. I hung out with my grandmothers. And that definitely has been impactful for me in the way that I see justice work and the way that I see feminism and the way that I see identity. After that season, I moved back to Greenville and I worked in nonprofit for a year where I did direct service and youth homelessness work. Again, reifying my commitment to justice as a material reality and leaning into that critical philosophical question of what do we take as obvious, interrogating some of these systems and how they make manifest the material gains or the material disadvantages of particular populations. And now for our students, I'm the assistant director of the Center for Inclusive Community, where I do social justice education at Furman. That's a little about my story.
That is so cool. And Jocelyn, I had a conversation with before she ever came to Furman. She was on my call list when I used to help admissions and would call prospective students who hadn't yet committed. And so Jocelyn was on that call list. And let me tell y'all, like, I don't know if it was just a spirit connection or what, but we hit it off that night. And when she showed up at Furman, she brought me biscuits from her grandma, and we have been genuine friends ever since. She is one of the few students who, even as a student, had no trouble putting me in my place when she thought I was saying something that needed challenged. And to this day, I am grateful that she is in my life. We had lunch yesterday, and she makes me smarter and helps me think deeper and more critically every single time we get together. So it's awesome to have you with us, Justin. And now let's hop over to her classmate, Maya Welburn, who also I met before she came to Furman at a summer admissions event. And we read Vonnegut together over the summer before she started at Furman, and kept reading philosophy together ever since. And now we have, in fact, co-authored an article together, which just came out this week. And so Maya is now publishing in the philosophy world and just freaking gangbusters and changing the field. So Maya, tell us about your story.
Yeah. I don't know. Gangbuster in the field, all of these phrases, I don't know what to do with them increasingly, but hey everyone, I'm Maya. I'm from, she, her pronouns. I'm from Rock Hill, South Carolina. So also sort of been in the South most of my life growing up. Went to Furman. After Furman, graduated and didn't know what I wanted to do, just majored in philosophy, but kind of figured I wanted to keep studying that. So I did a master's at Fordham University, which is in New York, in the Bronx, and also in philosophy. And I guess I started that right after leaving Furman, finished that in 2020, kind of during the pandemic. I'm interested in philosophy still. Right now, it's my first year. I'm in a PhD at University of Oregon. In terms of what I do, what I'm interested in, Generally, I'm interested in this field of philosophy that Simmons also knows quite well. It's phenomenology. Specifically, I'm interested in what's called critical phenomenology. It's kind of this emerging field, which is interested in like feminist or otherwise critical interventions in like traditional or classical phenomenology, beginning, I guess, like in the 20th century. Moving from there, I did an MA thesis, which was probably different than Jocelyn's. It was interested in how to develop this concept called excorporation for a critical phenomenology, which, if anyone's not familiar, phenomenology is interested in like the study of experience or how we experience certain like objects in the world, phenomena, what have you. Classical phenomenology is interested specifically in finding out about these transcendental structures, or the sort of like universal structures that actually allow us to experience sort of what those are. So critical phenomenology is interested more specifically in the sort of contingent historical, cultural structures of our experience, structures that aren't just transcendental, but sort of embodied or differentiate us in the social world per se. Still interested in that, still doing that. As a first year in a PhD program, I'm now sort of teaching students sometimes too, which is different and new and fun. Besides that, between programs, I've taken gap years. I've worked in the service industry in New York, done a lot of stuff during the pandemic. So just kind of worked and continuing to do grad school. So that's me.
It's awesome. And for any of you that are interested, Michelle Henry's Practical Philosophy is now available at a bookstore near you for about $750. And in there, you will find, yes, this amazing little essay called Affectivity and Its Effects by me and Maya. And so we had a ball writing that together, and it is an honor to see people that we taught philosophy to now writing philosophy that we can teach to others. And so it is truly a joy. Also, Maya is a very accomplished rock climber, which I think is absolutely nuts. She may have belayed, if I'm not mistaken, or like rappelled down some of the balconies at North Village, if I'm not mistaken. That may have happened. I don't know if you ever climbed the bell tower, but there are legends that we can start talking here. So Maya, absolutely fantastic. She and I have gone biking together, and she got to see me fly over my handlebars and wreck my knee into a tree. And that was just a few months ago. So yeah, relationships continuing. Well, now let's jump over to the person that if Will Smith had met, he would have revised the line in his song where he says, if your name ain't Hammer, Justin, or Usher, we can touch you. If he had met Noodle Zimmerman, he would have added his name to that list of dancing greats. So Noah Zimmerman recently engaged and absolutely tearing the world up for virtue and goodness. Tell us about your story, man. Where are you at and what are you doing?
Well, quite the introduction. I graduated in 2018 and then went to Duke Divinity School, and I got the same degree that Jocelyn got, an MTS. I also wrote a thesis. I guess it's loosely connected to phenomenology, about this guy named Nicholas of Cusa, medieval theologian. It was about icons and experiencing icons. My thesis director, Thomas Fow, has a whole book coming out on the phenomenology of the icon. So I can't say that it's full on phenomenology, but it at least hints at it. And from Duke, I then went to Penn Law, where I'm still now. I'm in my second year. My first summer, I worked at a U.S. Attorney's office, and then I interned for a judge this past semester. And this next summer, I'll be going to a firm in D.C. So that's what I'm up to now. Worked at it while I was at Duke. I worked at Duke University Press, which was a really great experience, being on the publishing side of the publishing industry. Still trying to keep up with scholarship as well. I'm actually trying to get what's in law school, you can work on a student. So in law school, journals and like the legal field generally, journals are student run. They're not peer edited, which, you can take your own opinions about that. But one of the perks of that system is that you can publish as a student with I would say a clearer path than trying to publish as a student as an undergrad. And so that's something I'm trying to do now on a guy named John Taylor of Caroline, little known anti-federalist and quasi philosopher of the Jeffersonian Party. So still looking for that niche scholarship industry, even as a lawyer. And yeah, philosophy has been tremendously important to me my whole life, and it continues to be so.
That's fantastic. And Noah was assigned to me as an advisee coming in as a freshman. And I'll never forget when he came to his advising meeting, because he brought his mom along. And I enjoyed meeting her. And to this day, Noah, respect the fact that your relationship with your parents was actually something that allowed advice and wisdom to come from others rather than saying, nah, screw it, I'm on my own. And so it really was inspiring to see the respect that you had for those who might have wisdom that would help you out. And so I think that's absolutely fantastic. Well, at this point, let's just open the floor. And Devin, Claire, and even Dr. Anderson, if you've got thoughts or questions that we want to, ask that might be helpful even for others or yourself, let's just open the floor. And if you have video capability, that'd be great, just so others can see you when they watch the recording. But Devin, Claire, any questions or thoughts that you might have? Yeah, Devin, hop in here, man.
Yeah, I have a question for Maya. So I'm actually in the process of applying to grad school as well. And so far, I got one school that is willing to take me. But then overall, I'm not sure, because this year, a lot of students are applying for grad school because it's the year after pandemic. So it is surprisingly competitive. But anyways, the question is there any suggestions or, I don't know, words of wisdom that you can have for me, that what should I look for when I'm choosing schools that eventually admitted me, or that what kind of a living cost should I consider? Because you mentioned you lived in New York for a while, right? So what was the living cost there like? Something like that.
Yeah, gotcha. Congratulations. That's really exciting. I'd love to talk to you more about it, or find out maybe where you got in or where you're hoping to go, where your interests are specifically. I'm sure you've talked to your professors at Furman about this. Every school is different. Every graduate department is different. None of them usually look exactly like Furman's kind of grad sort of department, right? Yeah, I mean, first of all, congratulations for getting in. Second of all, I would try and, communicate with the department, with the department head or whoever's reaching out to you as much as possible. Whether it's a master's or a PhD, find out what your funding is. Depending on where you're going to be, it's going to be expensive or less so. I would really try and get a feel for how the grad students feel about their department. I think that's really important. I had an experience at Fordham where a lot of graduate students, because it was in New York City, lived kind of dispersed. There wasn't a lot of community. We're talking about community, I guess, or Jocelyn's interested. But anyways, it didn't feel as if there was a very solid network or community. And one thing that is important that Simmons will probably emphasize for you, if he hasn't already, is that you go to grad school and it becomes a job. So it's not necessarily the same relationship you have with just taking classes as you've done right now. So it is a job. A lot of people treat it as a job. But also that doesn't mean that you can't find a community. Some departments are just healthier than others. I love my department right now. There's a very casual feel to it. Professors are very accessible. I would try and find out how communicative professors that you want to work with are with you. If you have loads of options. Also, the fact that you got into a program is great. And maybe we don't have loads of options for where we go to graduate school in the humanities, right? Depending on what you're going to grad school for. But yeah, I also enjoy your summer. Don't overwork yourself. Don't burn yourself out before you get there. Imposter syndrome is real. Try to realize that everyone is struggling with it, no matter what year you're in grad school. The 5th years and the 6th years are probably the most underwater, actually, and probably feel the least adept to apply to the 7 to 8 things they're applying to right now. So don't take it insanely seriously, but also it is difficult. yeah, in terms of living costs, I worked. So when I did my MA at Fordham, I worked. I worked at a coffee shop. I worked in the service industry. Eventually worked at a bar. So I just worked at places that I knew I would make money tip wise because I didn't make money in my MA. I didn't have a kind of like opportunity to. So find out maybe if you're interested in like doing something academic work wise as well. If it's an MA or something, find out about what opportunities the school might have, what sort of like fellowships you could get, or sort of kind of like maybe TA positions or something. But yeah, you have to be a bit more intentional when you get to grad school. Anyway, yeah. What are you planning on studying, or what are you interested in?
Just mainly continental philosophy, but also intersecting with critical theory a lot, mainly French philosophy.
Awesome.
And yeah, I got into Stony Brook, which has a strong continental program, but
Yo.
the thing is, they hold their class on Brooklyn, the cafe, but the campus is at Long Island, so commuting every day will be like 1 hour or so.
Someone in my cohort actually, she did an MA at Stony Brook. She could probably talk to you. Yeah, it's so you'd be maybe living in Brooklyn, maybe like taking the train or something like that. If it's a PhD, you'll be able to afford it. You'll have to have roommates. It's definitely doable if it's something you really want to do. But congratulations, that's really awesome.
Thank you.
It's fantastic, Devin. And it turns out just in the last 3-4 days, Devin's gotten into Stony Brook. We had another student that just got into Northern Illinois, and another one that got into George Washington. So we've had a really great, success in the last few days. Maybe before we jump to Claire's question, I'd love to hear, all of you have gone to some variety of post, college education, right? Post-secondary higher ed. Maybe you could just give us also a kind of few thoughts, because, not all of our students go to grad school in philosophy. Some go to divinity school, like Noah and Jocelyn. Some go to law school, like Noah. Some are doing, policy studies, like AJ. So AJ, Jocelyn, Noah, kind of how would you describe your experiences in going to school after graduating from Furman, and any advice or thoughts that you would have to share for people looking at those different directions? Let's start, Jocelyn. How about you?
Yeah. Thank you for putting me on the spot here to think out loud. So if these are rambling thoughts, I hope you are able to track. I decided to go to seminary at the behest of a religion professor, Dr. Fink. I was in a class called Wealth and Poverty in the Christian Tradition the spring of my senior year. And really, we were having this discussion around capitalism and what that means for people of faith, what that means for ethics, and this thing called morality. And I was in that course, and again, at his spurring, ended up applying to seminary, went to Vanderbilt. And the week before I started class were the white supremacist riots in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so my entire education around theology, ethics, its connection to capitalism was framed under how do we interrogate, disrupt, and imagine beyond white supremacy. And so my piece of advice to anyone thinking about graduate school or going into the workforce is, when we think about ethics, or when we think about whether they are normative or descriptive, I think something that we can do is often get like lost in the critical theory. And trust me, I am like definitely a critical theorist. So the critical theory is important, but I would encourage all of you to keep your imagination as critical to your ethical toolkit, because the critical theories will help us understand these issues better, and they will help us interrogate and disrupt. But then we have to ask the question, what does it look like to move beyond? And so a question that I listened to a podcast recently, and I'll have to like drop it because I can't really remember what the episode was about, but one of the critical questions in that podcast episode was, what does it look like to not just need to offer solutions to problems, but to imagine possibilities? And so that's my piece of advice, is never give up your imagination in thinking about what a more just world could look like.
Fantastic. It's like Richard Rorty said at one point, critiques are good, alternatives are better. So yeah, thanks, Jocelyn. AJ, what about you? Any thoughts about continuing with some sort of schooling and what that experience is like?
Yeah, sure. I think I come at it from a little bit of a different perspective than it sounds like some of the others. Maybe Noah can weigh in on this from the law school side, but my first graduate degree is in public policy. So it's a little bit more on the professional side than on the kind of research side. And now I'm in it sounds like we got 3 folks with MTSs here. Now I'm in an MTS program. So I've got kind of the academic side as well. But when I was first thinking about going back to policy school, I think when I left Furman, I really thought about going straight in. And a lot of folks counseled me to wait, to work a little while, to figure out what is the toolkit that I really want. And I ended up applying to a slate of grad schools. And the one that I would have gone to right out was pretty different than what I ended up actually doing. And I think a lot of that came from working and trying to decide, like, what is the toolkit that I need if I want to continue deepening the work that I was doing. And so I was doing work in the kind of international development space and knew that I wanted to go deeper there and have kind of a more quantitative set of skills. And so that was something that I just didn't pick up at Furman and needed to get later. And so that really refined the list of options for grad schools. And why I ultimately landed at UChicago is because they had, this strong urban sociology program that I really wanted to be affiliated with from my urban studies degree at Furman, and then going in also wanting the quantitative lens. And they, of course, kind of have the reputation for great economics department, and to being able to bring those two things together, it was a great match. But I think it was about having those 2 or 3 years between Furman and Chicago that helped me realize, like, what really is on the checklist. And that narrowed the list pretty significantly in terms of, these are the skills I need, this is the place I need to go to get them. And then I think to Maya's point about it being like a job, when I got there, it was like, great, I don't need to engage in the like a million things that are available to me. I need to engage in these like 4 or 5 things really deeply, because this is what I came here to learn. This is why I'm taking this time out of the workforce to do this. And I think similarly now in my MTS, it's like, okay, this is exactly what I want. I can kind of forget the rest and focus deeply on this work as well. So that's my 2 cents for people kind of headed in at least at the first part, professional path.
Fantastic. Thank you. Noah, what would you add?
Yeah, I would say one thing that I maybe misunderstood about graduate school, or maybe I just didn't think about at all, that's not out of the realm of possibility, was just the degree to which mentorship played such a significant role in my life at Furman. And once I hit grad school, it like dropped off completely. And that's just that's been my reality at Duke and at Penn. Really great people. I'm sure they've been great mentors to people, and they're not opposed to that, but they're churning out publications really, and they're working a lot, and they just don't have, in my experience, a ton of like mental capacity to be mentoring students, especially in comparison to a place like Furman, where, undeservedly students have professors going out of their way like this to really, invest in students on a personal level. And so mentors were huge for me at Furman. They're still huge for me now. Like I still stay in touch with Simmons and others. And I don't really stay in touch with people from Duke, and I don't really I'm not that close to the people at Penn, and that's no knock on them. And that's not to say that other people can't have those experiences. But if you did want that to be something for you, that you need to be incredibly proactive about that, like seek that out from the start, hit the ground running and say, I want you to be my advisor. I want you to be my mentor. Like, can we meet for coffee? Those sorts of things, because I really, unfortunately, I just took that for granted at Furman. And it's been absolutely crucial to my development. And I would say it's hard to make these big life decisions without mentors like that, in my experience. And so I guess the mentorship is one side of thing. Treating it like a job is another important thing too. I would say do as much as you can some self-exploration on that, like whether you feel as though you can make this be something that you would want to treat as a job. For me, like divinity school is a pretty isolating experience. I was spending a lot of time alone with the readings and like working on my papers and things like that, which is really great. Like I love research and writing. But again, without that mentorship aspect and without kind of the community aspect to go along with it, it was a hard time for me. And like mentally, if you're not, in my experience, like dealing with depression and like mental health, things like that, if you're not a good in space, like that's a really actually pretty volatile environment. So just kind of like, to the best extent you can, do a self-assessment. In my experience, that requires a lot of checking in with mentors, whether that be my mom or Simmons or both, and trying to be honest about like what, where you're at, what you can handle, and what you're looking for as well. Because I think too, coming out of Furman, I had this like superhuman mentality where I could do anything if I put my mind to it. And to a certain extent, that's like maybe true. Like you can maybe do most things if you put your mind to it. On the other hand, like sometimes that's just not fun. And even if it's not fun, maybe it's bearable, but sometimes it's not even bearable. Like law school is among the most atrocious experiences I've ever had to go through for a prolonged period of time. And I'm still signed up for another year and a half of it. And so you just have to be aware of kind of the commitments that you're making on the front end. The best way you can do that is through discernment actively. And don't let these big life decisions kind of sneak up on you to the best of your ability.
Fantastic advice and questions to think through for sure. Dr. Anderson.
Can I just chime in really fast?
Please.
I've heard this before, similar to what you just said, Noah. And it makes me worry because obviously at Furman, we're very accessible, we're very nurturing and so on. But I don't know if students realize that probably we're not representative. I mean, when you get to grad school, and I've had a number of students say, they thought grad school would be like Furman Part 2, and it's just not the case, and so I guess we just need to be better at sort of preparing people for that. I don't think that means we should be less nurturing now or less nurturing at Furman, but just that so that people have realistic expectations, don't you think? Or what do you all think about that?
Any thoughts on what we could do either better or differently, or how could we have prepared you for some of those things that you're all nodding in agreement about, right?
Yeah, on my screen, I had Maya and Noah, and you were both nodding. Actually, Maya, what resonated with you in what I was just saying?
I mean, I definitely felt at Furman like I was part of a community I'd never been part of before, especially just like the two of you. I felt like we're always accessible. We joked. There was such like a livelihood about the philosophy department.
There might be a picture of Dr. Anderson and I riding a tandem bicycle somewhere that Maya may have
it might exist. I'm not going to say if it does. Yeah, I mean, it was a really good time. At the same time, like while learning philosophy was sort of a thing that philosophy was very much in this spirit of the David Foster Wallace, like philosophy helps us do life, right? Philosophy is just doing life and doing it well. How do we live well? And that was something we definitely enacted at Furman. It was a stark contrast when I went to grad school. That first year of grad school for me was the most isolating year of my life. I mean, I was taking a course that I was absolutely excited about. It was on like these concepts of alienation and reification and like Devin, like critical theory and just like Habermas and Lukács. And it was really, really cool. At the same time, I felt so alienated. And I had so I just started, I mean, there's a sense in which at Furman, you don't have to be quite as intentional. You sort of live in this snow globe that's also a physical snow globe. Like the architecture of living at Furman is very much, we're walking down a hall and we're seeing all these people we're familiar with. Everything's familiar. And you're doing it and you're sort of doing this sort of thing with people for 4 years. Grad school is not quite like that, especially in like a city or metropolitan area, maybe. So I didn't live with people that were doing the same thing I was doing. I was sort of constantly moving through the social world of New York to get to and fro campus. I was having to do things for myself. Like I got really into like exercise in grad school, you have no more reason to procrastinate because you don't have a social life. So procrastination just becomes this thing that's not even a live option anymore. You just do stuff and you're like, wow. I mean, I felt for years if I grew so much as a writer in ways that I never grew as a writer at Furman, right? Because I would write things for Anderson the night before and he was like, oh, okay. and I like don't know how much I learned at the end of it. But in grad school, you have to do these things that it's a process of professionalization, and that's not something that I knew about, or it's sort of something I had to reflect on after a year of doing it. And I actually chose to take a year off after a year to finish my program, because it was so overwhelming, the way in which this switch from the sort of community. We did philosophy at Furman to learn. We showed up to class to learn. And there's this air in which I felt when I showed up to classes in grad school that so many people already knew the thing that I didn't even feel like class time was maximally about learning. It just was about discussing this thing that I sort of had to get up to speed with, which isn't necessarily true. But if you sort of jump into an environment that is sort of more atomistic, which is kind of ironic, right? Like continental philosophy loves to critique individualism and liberalism, but we're all sort of enacting it at the same time. But just keeping in mind that this process of professionalization starts to look very different in terms of not just research, but also like engaging in sort of these spaces. It looks different. There aren't a lot of commitments in grad school that aren't intentional, that you're choosing in a way that I think is different from Furman. Like a lot of our commitments are showing up to things because we have to, or because like all of our friends will, or it's like, what are we doing? Well, we're doing this thing. That looks way different in grad school, and for good reasons, because we're not in college anymore, right? But I'm not exactly sure how. Maybe at the same time, I want to say like yes to Noah and Dr. Anderson's points, but also I don't think if I had not had the mentorship I did in Furman, I would have never felt empowered enough to sort of maybe even be where I am now, right? I would have never felt like I knew enough about phenomenology or knew enough about continental philosophy to go explore more. So it's really important and crucial, but also the you that ends up in grad school will change because of the structure of it, and that's just what happens. I don't know what to do differently. I think Furman was really great. Yeah, I would maybe like take more people to more conferences. Like I don't know. I don't know.
That's great. And Jocelyn, I saw you were ready to speak as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think for me as a Black person and as a woman, to progress and to become successful in these fields often looks like going into spaces that are more white and more male. And those more white and more male spaces often are volatile and they have a toxicity, for lack of a better word, toward people who do not hold those identities. And as we've heard from AJ and Noah and Dr. Anderson on the call, even for folks who do hold those identities, that space can still be volatile and it can still be toxic. And so to echo Maya's point, 100%, I would not have felt empowered to even enter that space without the mentorship and without the professors that I had at Furman. And I do totally agree that I think going to more professional conferences is helpful. I also think something that Furman faculty could improve on is showing yourselves as scholars and showing yourselves as academics alongside being teachers. And so I definitely know there is this shock to the way that you all show up in conference space, and it's very different from how you show up in classroom space. And so I think operating in those two modalities is important for students to see, and it gives us the permission to recognize that when I am in this space, I, of course, can show up in a particular way. But if I show up in that eager to learn, just toward the thrill of this experience, that is going to elicit a particular type of response from the space of like, oh, you are just immature or you haven't been hardened yet. Like academic hazing is very, very real. And so I think we need to, I heard Maya and others bring up this idea of imposter syndrome. And I see imposter syndrome a little bit differently because it is like we may not have an internal sense of our own accomplishments that make us feel like we are imposters, but also what is the structure of the space that is not affirming of us and it's not affirming of our experiences. And so I think so much of the difficulty of grad school, I totally echo how isolating it is by and large, in part, just the structure of what that space looks like. So I think being honest with students about what that entails is critical for our like wellness. I was most actively in therapy when I was in graduate school, and I don't know what my experience during graduate school or on this side of it would have been without that support.
It's fantastic. Let's turn now to Claire, who I know has some questions also and is a graduating senior and thinking about futures and plans. And so, Claire, where are you at, and what might you like to ask these brilliant folks?
Yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of questions right now, just being a senior at this point. I don't know. This week it's been, and I think I was talking to Dr. Anderson about this earlier, just kind of trying to figure out like what life looks like for post-grad after like COVID and everything. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about a lot recently, and how my like post-grad career looked so different coming into Furman, and now it's completely different. And especially Dr. Simmons knows this, like I added philosophy late on, not late on, but it was sophomore year, right as soon as COVID hit. It just made sense. And I'm a communications major, and I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out what post-grad looks like, and I don't think it's going to be graduate school just yet. But I don't know. I was thinking today of like what I would want to ask like someone who's been navigating the career world for a while, because right now it just looks really foreign as far as possibility. And for philosophy too. Like I really want to continue learning and continue like just, I don't know, seeing a bunch of different perspectives that I didn't get to see before. And I don't know, like, do you have any advice as far as finding, I don't know, a way to keep on learning without graduate school? And I'm trying to apply that to like a career, just to get enough funds to figure out where I want to go from here. So any advice like applying?
It's a wonderful question. And I actually want to jump to AJ on this, since I know, AJ, you and I had lots of those sorts of conversations when you were here in her shoes, and, thought together about, whatever I do, I still want to be like, I want to be a philosopher, but I don't want to study philosophy necessarily. And I want to change the world, but I don't know how to do it. So how is it you would respond to that such heartfelt question of, how do I keep doing the thing that's awesome at Furman that we love about philosophy, even if I don't go to grad school and become a professional academic? How do we make that a habit, a virtue that we live into? What would you say?
Yeah, no, this is such a great question, and I like resonate with the way that you're asking it so much. I think one of the beautiful things about Furman is that it opens up the horizon in a way where you can leave and do whatever you would like to do, and then you are like ejected into the world, and it turns out that the horizon is still there, but it's much more difficult to navigate than it appeared on the other side. And I think senior year, you're looking across and like out at that and trying to reckon with that moment. And so, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience. I don't know if that constitutes any expertise in this, but I'll tell you maybe what it was like for me, kind of going over to the edge. And I think the biggest thing was first, like mentally preparing for that kind of transition. I found it to be very difficult to leave the community of Furman and the support network of Furman and go out into the world in a way where I felt like I didn't have, like my North Village apartment with me, like you're extracted from your support system, your network. And so I think part of it is, having an intentionality about who's the team you're bringing with you into this next chapter, and making sure that, they're ready with you. And I think one of the great things is that, likely there's strong relationships in Furman, you're all experiencing the same thing. So like, first you can kind of have that baseline. The second thing that I think I experienced and that I recommend to folks often is, especially if you're in this place of I know that I want to do something impactful and important and contributing to the world, but I don't quite know the shape of that thing yet. Try on lots of hats. Like, go and do many things for short periods of time. Take internships and, take fellowships and do different kinds of experiences, because the more you can pack that into your first 2 or 3 years, first, you're going to learn more quickly what you don't like, which is, I think, super important. You're going to become very aware of like the first job I had at a firm, and I worked as a lobbyist. And it's like, this is great. It was very shiny and important, and I worked for all these like big name companies, but I was like, this is morally devoid. I don't like this. I'm not interested in trying to convince towns that like they should not tax these big companies. So then, I went and did something else and something else. And I think I lived in 10 different cities in the 10 years between like starting at Furman and moving back to Charlotte. And in that time, like, had so many experiences, and through that really gained focus on like, A, what did I want to do grad school in? B, like, what were the big questions? And I think as those transitions were happening, to Dr. Simmons's question about how do you keep learning through it, it's like at Furman, I will admit I didn't do a great job of always doing the readings. And like, I think Maya was making this point also, like, you're invested in the academic experience in a different way in undergrad than you are when you get to grad school. And I think as soon as you leave that space, it becomes so important to like assign yourself readings. And I'm sure that there are folks, professors and mentors at Furman who will give you long lists of like, I emailed people and said like, hey, give me readings. Like, tell me, I have this question. How do I pursue this? And, now I have a shelf full of like book friends that like walked with me through that season. And I think that it's so wonderful to get the kind of freedom of like, no one is assigning you the reading. You can follow your curiosity where it leads. And that's going to unlock all kinds of interesting stuff for you. So I don't know, that's not very organized thoughts on it, but that was at least how I tried to reckon with that moment.
And yes, Noah also to hop in here, because I with the exception of one or two other students who, if I mentioned Dr. Anderson, would chuckle and say, oh yeah, that sounds right. Noah was one of those who had a vision of where he wanted to be, but then had about 1,700 different versions of what it might entail. And all of those were individual conversations in my office with him, like saying, well, this can't be right. So Noah, it was not that he like had no direction. It was just that direction opened onto lots of different paths. And now you've walked some of those, Noah. And so maybe you can speak also to Claire's question, which I think most of our students have, which is, I know I want to do something significant, and I've got an idea maybe of what that looks like, but there's so many different ways. How do I then move forward at all? What would you say?
Yeah, so I think I would start off by echoing what AJ said. I think one important consideration is maybe like choosing something, especially straight out of the gate, that doesn't foreclose other paths. Like, that was what was so great about divinity school for me, was like, I could still go get a PhD afterwards if I wanted to. I could still go to law school if I wanted to. I was thinking about MPA and MPP programs. And that was on the table, especially at Duke. Like, I could have done all of those things as a joint degree. So all of those things were on the table. As Simmons has acknowledged, like, very much about keeping as many doors open as possible. That's been true for me even in law school. Like, as I sit here today, I still don't know what I'm going to do. And I find that empowering. I think that's a super great position to be in. I think philosophy majors tend to be of the sort that like to keep doors open and think about a lot of different things and see many avenues to serving like a greater purpose. I think that's even true working as, like Maya's talked about, in the service industry. Like, one of my best friends, he's slinging coffee and his life is great. Like, I'm envious of him in many ways because he gets to read what he wants to read. And if he's really passionate about it, he'll tell me to read it too, and we can read it together. And like, that for me is, I think, kind of what philosophy is all about. And I think the luxury of being able to read what you want to read at the pace that you want to read it is very real. And I didn't appreciate that really until, except for the summer in between Furman and Duke, and then my summer in between Duke and Penn. I mean, I just read a ton for fun, and it was 2 best summers of my life. And I guess all that to say, like, I think short-term commitments are really great in this instance because it does allow you to feel things out, especially things that aren't going to cause you to overinvest. You know, when you think about graduate degrees, I think a default position sometimes for, in my experience, philosophy majors coming out of undergrad, their thought is I have to go to graduate school, and they're willing to pay to make that happen. And sometimes that's the right choice, and I totally respect that choice, and it works out well for a lot of people. But sometimes if you're just kind of defaulting to graduate school, that's not necessarily a great option because you're paying for it, and for the reasons I mentioned before about the lack of mentorship and things like that, you end up finding yourself in a somewhat similar space to where you found yourself 2 or 3 years prior, except now you're more in debt. So finding things that pay you money, that don't require you to sign away, several years of your life to do it, and that allow you the freedom of time, honestly, and also maybe think about it geographically too. If you're like Duke, for me, I ended up living within a 45-minute drive of 2 out of my 3 roommates from college. And that was huge for me because I didn't have the mentorship going on, but I did have the friendship and I could talk to them about it. So thinking about kind of, as AJ said, interpersonal connections as well, I think is, something that should be on your radar. You want, in my experience, Furman gives you a lot of space, but not a lot of application. And once you leave Furman, automatically you'll be applying, but depending on what you do, you might not have the space to think about it. So trying to find something that gives you space to think about it while also trying out various applications, for me, was what struck the right balance.
That's really smart. And that's a sort of Claire, academic version or career version of what I'm sure you have heard me say, and many of you have heard me say, which is a life lesson. Don't get married just because you never broke up. Right? That's not a good way to start a life. And so, Noah, I appreciate your wisdom on this. Well, I want to respect our panelists' time. And so before we close out, any other questions, Devin, Claire, Dr. Anderson, anything that you want to make sure you get a chance to ask before I ask them to give a few final comments?
I just wanted to ask, so I was signing up a new major the other day, and she was reluctant. She had the worry that many, I'm sure, of us have had, which is, how is the philosophy major going to look to employers? Or once I leave Furman, is it going to, should I major in something that sounds more conventionally acceptable? And I'm just wondering, I kind of like to check in every once in a while to see like what people's experience is when they leave Furman and they tell people they were philosophy majors. What do people think that means, and how do they perceive it?
It's a great question. Who wants to jump in on that?
I just finished hiring somebody who had philosophy masters on their resume. And I was hiring for a job that had what seemingly was nothing to do with philosophy. But this person I was hiring to do primarily like data analytics work. But at the end of the day, what I was asking them to do was to build a list of indicators to measure a certain social challenge. And so it was important to me to have somebody who had the background. He had an ethics master's, because I said, ultimately, we're making decisions about how people understand the nature of a problem. And a lot of my work deals with inequality and deals with the way that we talk about issues of equity. And so having somebody who had that background in that conversation and would be able to understand how we position data in a way that equips people for productive conversations on issues related to economic mobility, related to inequity, related to race, related to class, was so much more important than all these other people who had Python and R and like Stata and all these deep coding skills. And clearly I needed that as well. But the thing that made this guy stand out was the fact that I knew he would be able to see beyond just the number crunching to the why of it. How do we build, I think I said this in my intro, like I see my work even though it is number crunching a lot of the time, and we're doing an epistemological thing. We're creating knowledge for people. We're creating understandings of problems, and having that philosophy background was the value add that got this guy through the door for me.
That's fantastic. And as Nietzsche says, right, if we have a why, we can endure any what. And in many ways, right now, our hearts and minds and thoughts are with, the brave folks in Ukraine standing against a what that is overwhelming. It's insurmountable. And yet they have a why. And so, AJ, yeah, I think you're hitting on the thing that all of us philosophy professors hope we are inviting you all to think through, and it's not, one of the weird things about these sorts of panels, right, is that what we're not saying, this is why it's a diverse group. We've got people in law school, student services and diversity work, nonprofit poverty policy, and academic philosophy. And the fact that philosophy opened all of those different directions is the point. Like, none of us are trying to educate our students, say, do this. What we're trying to say is, whatever you do it on purpose, right? Be where you are, follow your feet, and then be good at it. Right. And I think, AJ, yeah, that's a really good way to put that. Have any of you run into any interviews? I know, Jocelyn, you've done a lot of interviewing. Like, you've run into interviews where that question was asked. Oh, you studied philosophy. And there was some way that came into the conversations.
Oh, yeah, 100%. So after I finished at Vanderbilt, so currently I am in higher ed, which is a sector I've been wanting to get into for a very long time. Neither one of my degrees are in higher education. And as I was applying, folks would say, wow, you're really qualified in terms of content and subject matter expertise. You have the skill set, but you don't have the qualifications. Why should I hire you? And I'm a little bit snarky in my interview style because I want people to think beyond, again, what they take as obvious. And so my question to them was, when I told you I was a philosophy major, what was your reaction? And they said, oh my gosh, when I think of philosophy, I just think people who are really, really smart and really, really thoughtful. And I said, you know what? I'm really, really smart and I'm really, really thoughtful. And every other person who I know who is a philosophy major who did study this thing is really, really smart and really, really thoughtful. And I would hope that you would want smart and thoughtful people on your team. And that was the thing. They were like, yes, we want those people.
That freaking rocks. What a great comment. Well, we're going to have to close out. And so as we do, I want to ask all of you a question that is probably harder than it should be, and yet might spring to mind. It's something I sometimes do in my intro to philosophy classes, which I'll have freshmen and then I'll have seniors, right? And this wide mix of people. And what I've started doing on usually the last day or next to the last day of class is I'll ask the freshmen, what's the one thing you wish you could have asked a senior upon starting college? And I ask the seniors, what's the one thing you wish a senior had told you on your first day at Furman? Right? And it's such an interesting thing to hear what they say. So what I want to hear from the four of you is this. What's the question you would have asked this panel when you were the junior or senior at Furman? In other words, what is it that now you realize you should have been interested in knowing? Right? What would you say? Who wants to dive into that? Thanks, Noah. This is for getting you back for the conversation we had when you said, Dr. Simmons, I want to do some extracurricular activities. How many do you think's too many? I was like, dude, whatever, man. Whatever, floats your boat. No, but I'm thinking maybe 3. Do you think I could do 3.6? Y'all, 45 minutes trying to tell him it doesn't matter, man. Yeah. So we'll let you go first, Zimmerman.
Yeah, I actually remember that conversation. It was whether I should do 7 or 8, which is just embarrassing. So I think the question that I would have asked is, am I going to be okay? And I think the answer sitting here now is yes. I think maybe that's giving it away, but I think I obviously as Simmons and Dr. Anderson have experienced, like, I have a lot of questions. I still have a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions since I was like a young child. That's always going to be the case. I'm always going to think about the future, think about myself, think about the world. That's part of what made me, I would say, like a good suit for being in the philosophy department. I think among the things that being a philosophy major does is help you to see how you can be okay in any situation. I think, you know, one of the things that was affirming for me was seeing other people who had gone on to do various different things and be okay. And it's great for me to see my friends all being okay, whether they're philosophy majors or not. And that's not to say that things aren't hard and life isn't hard, and that Furman is a uniquely, honestly, magical experience, as it was for me. But that is to say that you are equipped to take on whatever comes your way. And, you know, Furman hopefully is giving you some of the right people to take along the way with you. And because of that, yes, you're going to be okay.
I love it. It turns out, Noah, that the almost unanimous thing that the seniors say they wish a senior had told them as freshmen, you're going to be okay. Almost ubiquitous. That's the answer I get from those seniors. Really, really, really fantastic. Maya, what would you have asked yourself if you were back at Furman?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess me answering as a senior probably looks a lot different than me answering now. I think I would have wanted to know, how will I know that I'm doing the thing that, like, how will I know that that whatever I'm doing is the thing I want to be doing? Because I'm never quite sure. I'm a very good existentialist, but I think I would just answer and be like, well, you're doing it. Just look around. And also maybe this is kind of related to Dr. Anderson's question. There were a lot of things that I wanted to know about or wanted to learn. They were always sort of abstract, or I hadn't learned them yet. And then when I've sort of been going in and out of grad school, I've realized that I can sort of treat work and I was never career oriented. So, but I did want to know how to build bikes better, or I did want to know about wine or about coffee. And having a philosophy background and having a philosophy degree is sort of, you're never done learning philosophy. That's kind of the thing about doing philosophy, or what it teaches you, is that however much more you learn or figure out, you realize just like how much more there is to learn and how much more you don't know. So I think for me, in sort of like balancing like what I don't know, like what do I want to do with my life, like that question's never settled and it's never answered. But I have been able to, like, because I'm a very good or I'm very good at deconstructing writing now as a philosopher, I can apply to service industry jobs like during the pandemic. Worked at Trek Bike Shop, like did a bunch of stuff with them. Also to Jocelyn's point, like even if you don't have the technical skills to do something, I think I've learned that having done philosophy and how hard it is allows me to just sort of be the most intentional I can be. I'm extremely hardworking now. So whatever it is I do want to figure out or do want to do, I can go do it. And then I'll probably want to do something else too, maybe. But yeah, I guess just sort of, how will I know that this is what I want to do with my life? It's just like, you're doing it. You're doing the things you want to do. It doesn't have to look like a sort of straight linear path forward. Yeah.
So smart. You are who you're becoming, right, Wilburn?
We live forward and understand backward.
I've heard that somewhere. AJ, and then we'll finish up with Jocelyn tonight.
I think the question I would have asked when I was leaving Furman, that I think is a question a lot of Furman students ask, that I'll answer the question that you're asking, Dr. Sims, in a little bit of a different way. The question that I would have asked when I was leaving Furman is, when will all of it matter? Like, when will I create the impact in the world? When will I change everything? Because clearly, you know, you go to Furman, you're the big fish in the small pond, you're the smart kid on the block, and you just know the moment you get out in the world, like, you're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize the next year, and then, you know, you're going to, I don't know what you do after that, but like, I think a lot of Furman students, myself included, if there was a club for this, I would have been the captain of the team. Like, think that that's just imminent and you're just waiting for it to happen. And I think the question I wish I could tell myself to ask instead is, how can I be happy with what's around me now? How can I be content? What does it look like to notice the world and to love it because it's here? And reprioritize not when will I matter and when will I make the waves in the world, but how will I know, like, how will I have a good Thursday? And it took, like, I feel like I'm learning how to ask that question every day, but certainly 2015 AJ did not know how to ask that. And I wish I would have started learning how to ask that question a lot earlier.
This is water, right? Over and over and over. Jocelyn.
The question, if I were a senior, I would ask myself is, how do you take care of yourself? And my answer would be that there is no clear-cut answer, but it's all about practices. And we can put those practices in place so that we hopefully are creating, to the best that we can, a life that we don't have to escape from. And so whether that looks like being mindful of our finances and paying our bills on time and being conscientious of that, whether it looks like prioritizing relationships. If I'm being totally honest, the first question that popped into my mind when you asked this question, if I was a senior, I would ask myself now, like, did you marry him? And because I was dating my current spouse at the time, and I would have hopefully said to 2017 Jocelyn, does it matter? Does it matter the big life decisions that you've made? Are you present? Are you where your feet are? Are you, again, like AJ was saying, are you soaking in everything so that what matters now is mattering now, even if it is going to get coffee with that boy you really like? And that's what I would have asked myself.
Walk together and talk along the way. Sometimes coffee's more than coffee, Jocelyn. So there's this great line by a writer named Anne Lamott, who I draw on often. And it sticks with me so deeply. She says, why have we allowed ourselves to become people who, when confronted with the waterfall, right, out in nature, you're looking over, we're the sort of people who take out our phones. Right? Why is it that we don't actually say, oh my gosh, I'm standing at the foot of the waterfall? We want to make sure that we get the picture so that we can show other people that we were at the waterfall. And then, of course, if you're my wife, you put like 3 filters on it. So the waterfall is now 17 times higher and the sun is the exact tone you wanted. And, so how do we become people who, when confronted with waterfalls, don't take out our phones? And I think ultimately philosophy doesn't tell you what to do to answer that question, but maybe it invites you to see that that question is one you're going to keep asking and keep living into and keep enacting. And that this is ultimately, right, Maya, what affectivity is really about. This is ultimately, Noah, what law invites us to think through. How do we have the structures that facilitate flourishing? And Jocelyn, this is why caring about embodiment is so important, because we are not brains in vats. And AJ, ultimately, if you haven't got other people who are going to like give you a fist bump or a hand to pull you up or to say, hey, you got this, it's easy just to sit down and not run anymore, right? So to the students watching, I sent 4 emails to put this panel together, and all 4 said, absolutely, tell me when. This is the kind of community that exists even years after you leave Furman, and it's the kind of thing that is worth doing. And so I cannot tell you for how much I appreciate you being here. Devin, Claire, Dr. Anderson, thank you all for joining us in person, as it were. I will, like I say, convert the video to a form where I can get it up on YouTube and distribute it with our students. We'll be having more of these sorts of things with other alums. And if any students watching this one want to reach out and talk directly to any of the 4, AJ, Maya, Noah, or Jocelyn, please let me know. I will give you their information. They would love to hear from you, unless Maya is studying for an exam or Noah is in the midst of finals. But otherwise, They're good. And one final plug, Jocelyn's on campus, y'all. So part of her job is like having coffee with y'all. So please make sure that you are not graduating at Furman without meeting this amazing human who makes the world better. So you all, you rock my face. You make the world a place I'm happy to be part of, even when it is threatened by nuclear war, threatened by tyranny, threatened by despair and human vulnerability. Nonetheless, as Aristotle says, friendship matters. And I am truly blessed to have friends like you.